This video that I'm making is going to be how to line bore an LS block, although it can be applied to many other blocks. But I want to cover a few things before the video gets going here. This is going to be a two-part video. This is going to be the first part of the video. I'm not going to be able to put everything I want to put on one video, so there's going to be two parts to this, so I'm warning you now. Some of this might not be that exciting for you, but it should be informational. Probably not going to cover every single thing. This is the way I do it. This may not be the way other people do it. This is the way I've done it in the past. I don't claim to be a line bore expert, although I have line bored plenty of blocks. Now, the LS has got a powdered cap. That means it's pretty much the shape of the cap, and then they machine it. So the sides of the caps on the LS's usually are pretty darn flat. This is a big block cap. You can see it had a high spot here and there's a low spot there. That's machined from the factory. Now, some guys have a different cap cutter fixture that holds the cap, and they'll side cut it on the machine, and that'll make this surface relative to that surface. I put it on a belt sander because I don't have that option on mine. I've never had it be a problem, but there's other ways of cutting the cap, and there's other machines too. This just happens to be the cap cutting machine that I have. Now, on these caps, it ain't so important. You want to be relatively close from this surface to that surface. I usually surface both sides of the cap. So here's a small block Chevrolet cap that I've just flattened out a little bit, and this would be the other side. Usually I do both sides of the cap. Now, there's a backstop on this machine. Now that's relatively flat and relative to the stone, so I'll make a light cut on this cap and I'll look at it, and then I'll assess which way I want to shim it. I could shim off the backstop this way, so I'll put a feeler gauge in here and I'll shim it accordingly. I'll make a light cut and I'll see. Now if it's high, it hits here and it hits over here, and it's low here and it's low there, chances are I'm going to cut the whole cap, because the cap has just got a little twist to it. That happens, but as long as you're cutting clean across the cap, there's no need to shim it. Sometimes you have to shim them, and you have to do that on connecting rods too. It's a very normal procedure. To assume that this cap is relative to that is usually not always true. Now when you get into a billet cap or an aftermarket cap, that's a whole different animal. But these caps aren't necessarily flat to begin with. The LS's are somewhat flat. I wanted to address that. I also wanted to address, on this video you'll see me say the center main caps were turning black. Well, they were turning black, not the actual cap. If they do turn black or purple, chances are that cap is junk. You're going to have to replace it. I was referring to the simple fact that the cap was fretting enough on the block to the cap that it was transferring material from the block and the cap, and it was making it black, and there was actually aluminum stuck to the cap surface. It was so coarse it was sticking into the cap. So I wanted to cover that on this video. Now, like I said, I'm not going to cover every single thing, but if you're curious or you want to learn how to line bore, although my machine's a tobin ARP, unless you have a tobin ARP, but some things are the same. You're going to cut the caps. You're going to go through some of the things that I do in this video. But that's what I wanted to cover. I believe that should be good. There's different cap cutters, like I said. There's different stones you can get. You can buy CBN. I think you can buy a CBN wheel for these. I'm still using a vitrified stone. On steel caps, they make a white wheel. I found them cut. I was doing a lot of billet cap blocks. Them cut pretty quick. This is just a general purpose blue stone from Sonnen. it cuts everything relatively good, although I feel that the white stone cut billet cap's better. So that's kind of it. Hope you enjoy the video. Like I said before, I'm just warning you, it's going to be a two-part video, so I should have the rest of the video probably next week sometime. Okay, before I put this block on its bottom here on the table and put the deck plates on it, put it on the machine, this will probably be the end of this video. I don't think I can stretch it out any further, but I wanted to address something. With my Tobin ARP, I center up on this end of the block and this end of the block. Now, if this was damaged, I'd center up on this one. If this one was damaged, I'd center up on this one. But I try to center up on two that aren't hurt. Now, this block isn't really hurt, although this housing bore is a little bit bigger. It's relatively close. Now, you always want to make sure you cut enough material off the caps that you do not have to take the machine off, the block off the machine, let's say. You do that with my machine, it's a big deal. You also want to make sure you drop it far enough down here in the saddle that you're going to clean up all the way around. On a block that's hurt, that's judgment and discretion. After doing a few of them, you kind of get an idea, but on something that's spun out really bad, it's never a guarantee 100%. You're not going to have to raise up the block and move it. You know, you can shim the block with feeler gauge stock. With my particular machine, that would probably be the best option. With other machines, I can't speak for them because I've only run my Tobin ARP. Line boring is different than line honing. I don't have a line hone machine, I have a line bore machine. So that's what we're going to do. We're not talking about line hones, so if anybody says anything about line hone machines, I don't line hone. Nothing wrong with them, just don't do it. You always want to make sure you don't take any more off than you have to. With this particular block, I'm going to bring it up probably 2/1000ths. With my machine, even though I have different tooling for measurements than the original stuff is fairly accurate, but you know, you're splitting hairs from 2 to 3, you know, from 2 to 1.5, you know, if anywhere is around there, but we're going to try to take the least amount off as possible. Remember that the further you drop the saddle down, the more you're going to have to take off the caps. You're going to have to figure that out. You know, if you drop it 5/1000ths, you know, the cap, and depending on how big the housing bore is already, you know, you could be cutting a fair amount off the caps. But my opinion is, it's better to cut a few thousandths off the caps more than you need than to want to put it on, you know, take it off the machine and try to take it off the cap later. So it's better to have it a little bit tighter than what you need. Now I'm going to shoot for the small end of the housing bore, and I already know that this one back here is 3/1000ths off from the housing bore, and I know that I'm going to drop it down too, so that makes 5/1000ths that, you know, I have to kind of account for. So whether you agree with that or not, that's fine, but if you're bringing a circle down in the circle, we can't make the circle bigger. We can, but actually I want to make it smaller. So there's a chance between the 3 and the 9 position, if you're thinking about a clock, that there might be what we call a dead area there. And there's not a lot you can do about that. It depends on how bad it is. Now, in some engines, they do make an oversized housing bore. I don't want to get too far out in the weeds, confuse too many people, or bore you to tears, but sometimes you don't have to move the center line at all. You just find where everything is and you just bore it out bigger. The problem with them bearings is there's few and far between of them, depending on what you're building. And then if you start getting into an oversized housing bore, you might not get the availability the next time you want to rebuild it. So welcome back to McCarthy Performance. We are working on the LS engine, and I pointed out to the customer the 3 middle main caps were black, and I was concerned about that. So right after that, we did a dye check. Everything passed, and checked it. Everything looked pretty good up until we torqued the caps up. The caps didn't have any arch in them, but you can see where the bearings were walking around and wearing. There was not enough crush on these. It was past 2.5 thousandths past the big end of the spec. I don't know how the bearings even stayed in it, to be honest with you. So we're in the process of right now of cutting the caps. Caps are all cut. That'll be in this video, of course, and we're going to chamfer them lightly. We've already broke the edges. We're going to get ready to fit the caps to line bore this block. We are not line honing it, we are line boring it. We'll be doing that on my tobin ARP. That's pretty much what this video will be. cap is at 0. That cap is at 0. That cap is at 0. And that cap's at 0. Of course, this is the thrust. You always want to make sure your thrust is square, and we'll be spending a little bit extra time on that, measuring the housing bore and making sure from front to back that there's no deviation in it to speak of. Looks like we've got 0 right there to the end. Bump the other gauge. And we're, if anything, we're a half a thousandths. No, maybe not. Yeah, 0. That's probably close enough. If you get the rear thrust, well, this is obviously not a rear thrust, but if you get any of the thrusts, if it's a rear or in the center or wherever the hell the thrust is on the block, if you get the cap cocked, of course, it's a flange bearing, it's going to block the crank up. So there, I want to make sure that it doesn't interfere with this tang. Most of the time it don't, but that's something you got to check. So all the caps have been deburred. Broke most all the edges off these. These are usually razor sharp, so I'll try to clean them up somewhat. We're going to be going over the registers here lightly. We're not going to try to change the dimension, but we want to make sure there's no high spots. So we'll hit that with a stone. We'll do that shortly here. Of course, you want to make sure that you break these edges lightly as well. That keeps, on aluminum it isn't so much of a problem, but you don't want to bring any of that in underneath the bearing when you roll it in. I'll follow up with a piece of sandpaper. Appears at one time this block lost a thrust. There's a groove in this. Something got between number 5 and the crank and put a gouge in the block. Who knows what that was? Could have been part of a piston or God only knows what. Got a high spot there, high spot there. And I'm going to go over them one more time. Call it good. Right there's a high spot. There's a scar on this one. Something got between the cap and the block. Could have been anything. It was obviously a foreign piece of material. That's why we break these edges and deburr the cap so there's nothing that falls off the cap. My guess is it's a little piece of the cap that fell down in there because it's real fine and it's real narrow. And it held the cap up. When it did that, I don't know. But it definitely happened. And of course you don't want to do this if you're just putting the caps back on, but seeing how we're line boring it, we can do a little bit of this. But if you see a high spot on your cap, you know, on the register, you always want to dress it down. Anytime you put a dent in something, you're going to braze up the sides of it, and that's what happened there. That's going to affect your crush and affect your clearance, bearing clearance, if it's big enough, you know. So there we are. Okay, so we're putting the caps back on the block. There's quite a bit of controversy about whether or not you should put deck plates on this when you line bore them. Most of the aluminum blocks that I've done, I'll put deck plates on it. So that's an added operation on the job, which takes much longer. With these blocks, as they're cross bolted through as well, you want to make sure that nothing binds when you're putting the fasteners in the block. Now, these are studs, and I treat studs a little different. I know guys that will take and drop a ball bearing down here, and that'll keep the stud from bottoming out. You don't want the stud to bottom out on the threads. You will break the block. You don't ever want the stud to bottom. Now, some studs come, I call it with a bullet on the end of it, and what that is it has no thread, and it just keeps this threads from bottoming out into the block, bottoming out into the threads. You'll wedge it, you'll split the block. These don't have it. On a stud like this, what I do is I'll thread it all the way down. But first I want to go over something. You don't ever want to just fill it up with oil. You just want to put a little bit of oil on here. Now I use oil on studs and they thread into the block. I use the ARP or the other stuff that a lot of guys use. There's a bunch of them depending on whose fastener it is. But I pretty much use the ARP, and what I'll do is I'll thread it all the way down until it stops. You don't ever want to force the stud into the block. You don't ever want to force it bottomed out. They should thread in easily by hand. Okay, that's stopped. Back it out a half a turn to a full turn. There's plenty of threads on these. I did a full turn. What that's going to keep you from doing is when you tighten up the stud until it gets up to a pull, it's going to keep it from clocking and winding itself down into the block. A full turn pretty much stops that. So that's guess what I wanted to say about that. Of course, if you have a problem putting studs in a block that never had studs, a lot of guys get this screwed up. Not saying this on this particular block, but let's use 454s, big blocks, 4-bolt main blocks, 2-bolt main big blocks. Let's use that for an example. The stud is not necked down. The bolts are from the factory. It is shouldered up at the top with the factory bolts. When you go to a stud, you sometimes have to open up the bolt hole, because if you don't, it'll put the cap and it'll bind the cap, and that's, I'm not going to say that's most all the problems that people think they have to have their blocks line honed after putting different fasteners in it like studs, but you must be aware of that the factory sometimes doesn't drill stuff as good as they could, and the bolts have a little wiggle room. When you go to studs, there's no wiggle room. I'll show you. What we have here is we have a ARP stud. As you can see, it's not necked down. This is a factory windage tray bolt for a big block Chevrolet. See how it's necked down? A lot of times these will bind a little bit. So you always want to be aware of that when you go to a stud. Sometimes you have to open up the caps. I just thought I'd mention that.